this is what I'm going to try and cover in 45 minutes. So at a certain point, I'm going to start going very, very fast, I suspect, to try and get through it all. Just as a health warning, the last two topics I'm covering, I'll almost certainly be wrong, just because things are changing so fast that it's very, very hard to get a grip of what actually is going on, let alone what is going to happen over the next few weeks and months. Let me start on relatively safe territory, which is the territory of what happened in the referendum itself. And I think there are two things here. Firstly, and sort of self-evidently, part of the reason why the British voted to leave the European Union was because the British were never particularly comfortable with membership of the European Union. Take whatever measure you like, or its levels of European identity, whether you think membership is a good thing or a bad thing, even levels of knowledge about the European Union, which Eurobarometer always poll about. Britain was proudly in the bottom one or two, always. I think we were briefly undertaken, I suppose, by Greece in 2011, when it came to the numbers of people who didn't think membership was a good thing, but the Greeks quickly overtook us again the next year, putting us back in bottom place. So across the piece, there's been a deep dissatisfaction with membership, to the point where Ipsos Mori did a poll in 1978, so 3 years after the referendum, that confirmed our membership, asking people if we had that referendum again, how would you vote? 66% of people said we'd vote to leave. So even by 1978, public mood against membership had hardened quite significantly. It's also worth saying that the Leave campaign didn't magic grievances out of the air in 2 of the 3 cases of its main themes. The main themes of the Leave campaign were money, what we pay in the European Union, sovereignty, the question of control and autonomy, and finally immigration. The first 2 had actually predated our membership. I mean, remember in 1962, Hugh Gateskill gave that speech saying, if we joined the European community at the end of 1,000 years of British history. We were arguing about sovereignty long before we joined. And actually, we were arguing with the French about money before we joined, because, of course, the 1970 budget settlement in the European community was partly pushed through by the French in a desperate attempt to make sure, if we joined with a relatively efficient agricultural sector, we would pay disproportionately for those countries that didn't have an efficient agricultural sector. So those beefs about money and sovereignty are long-standing, lasted from before our membership all the way through it, and were capitalised upon by the Leave campaign. The one exception to this was immigration, the other key strand of the Leave campaign. And here there was an interesting shift between 1975 and 2016. In 1975, people who thought there had been too much immigration into the United Kingdom were marginally more likely to vote to remain inside than they were to vote to leave. By 2016, of course, that situation had changed fundamentally. One of the best predictors of how someone was going to vote was their view of whether or not there had been too much immigration into the United Kingdom. And ITV do this word cloud. That's the word cloud of Remain supporters and Leave supporters on the day of the referendum itself. And I think that gives the lie to those Leavers now who are claiming, of course, our campaign had nothing to do with immigration. It was all about liberalism or something like that. But I'll come back to the contemporary debate in a moment. So far, so absolutely bleeding obvious. We voted to leave the European Union partly because we'd never been comfortable as members. But there's more to it than that, I think. And I think, you would have always had 35 to 40% who would have voted to leave because of this sense of dissatisfaction with membership. But it took more than that to take us over the 50% line. I think that is down to what's happening in domestic politics and the domestic economy. Now, in domestic politics, for me, the key theme is increasing disenchantment with the 2 big political parties. And I think, broadly speaking, for 2 reasons. One, because since following Tony Blair becoming leader of the Labour Party basically converged with the Conservative Party over economics. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that the parties are identical. All I'm saying is they basically converged on a position of being in favour of minimising the role of the state in the economy, in favour of markets, in favour of trade, in favour of globalisation, so that those people, either who had suffered directly because of these policies or didn't like these policies for whatever reason, felt increasingly that there wasn't a mainstream political alternative that they could vote for that would reflect their preferences. And the second part of that, of course, was to do with values. And I'll come back to values because they're fundamental. But the two parties also converged to a significant extent over values. Both big political parties, in essence, became increasingly socially liberal. And it was, of course, the Conservatives that ended up legislating in favour of gay marriage. Now, this isn't a comment by me on what those values should be. It's simply a statement of the fact that whenever you poll the British people, something approaching 50% of them claim to be not socially liberal. So again, you have this situation of relative disenchantment with a mainstream consensus that didn't seem to reflect the views of many people. And I think Bridget Christie, the comedian, captured this rather nicely. I think it was about 2013. She wrote this absolutely hysterical article about Andrew Lloyd Webber. And she said Andrew Lloyd Webber has been a member of the House of Lords for many years, but during his long tenure as a peer, he has bothered to come back to London and vote in the House of Lords twice. First time he came back to vote in favour of ending working tax credits, i.e. ending assistance given to the state to those people who don't earn very much in their jobs. The second time he came back to London to vote in the House of Lords, he came back to vote in favour of gay marriage. And Bridget Christie quipped, Andrew Lloyd Webber nicely captures the political zeitgeist of our time. He loves gays, he hates the poor. Now, this was a comedian being facetious on the pages of The Guardian, but there's more than an element of truth to this if seen, when viewed from outside the main metropolitan centres of the United Kingdom. That was the direction of travel, it seemed, of our major political parties, and that matters in a first-past-the-post system because ultimately one of the two big parties will form the government. And so you immediately find significant sections of the population feeling that their votes didn't count. I remember we did a public event up in Sunderland just before the referendum, and a woman said to me, look, the problem with our elections, the reason why I never bother voting, is here in Sunderland you could stick a red rosette on a donkey and it would win. That's just the way these things go. It is a safe Labour seat. So what's the point? Why should you vote? So what you see over the course of this century is falling turnout, massively falling party membership, and hugely increased political volatility, meaning people's propensity to shift their vote from one party to another. Remember, votes used to be a traditional thing. You voted what your parents did, what your community did. 2010 and then 2015 broke records for political volatility. People feeling dissatisfied with their choice. And of course, 2015 also saw 3.8 million people vote for UKIP to win the princely prize of one MP. So you have a system that makes people feel like if you don't agree with this mainstream view adopted increasingly by both big parties, there is nowhere for you to go. And Sarah Hobart at the LSE has written convincingly about the fact that those dissatisfied with politics were hugely more likely to vote Leave. But I'll come back to it in a minute, because I think the other issue here is economics. And I think increasing inequality, and particularly the impact of the financial crisis of 2008, also fed into this sense of disillusionment with the establishment, the elite, the metropolitan centre, whatever you care to label it. Now, for all the number of times that George Osborne would declaim the fact that we were all in this together, the economic data didn't bear this out. So there, the top yellow line are the top Remain voting constituencies, the blue line are Leave voting constituencies. And all I want to show schematically is that actually there is something economic underlying this as well. That actually the gap between the major Leave voting seats and the major Remain voting seats increased over the period of the Conservative government. But I think more than this, what happened was the perception that what people in London were talking about made any sense or had any relevance to other people was being eroded. Again, we did, just before the referendum, I was asked to go up to Newcastle to do a question and answer session in a pub about Brexit. And basically the format was simple. You turn up, they'll ask questions, you answer them. So I turned up, and if you remember pre-referendum Britain, there was an interest in politics like you've never felt before. I mean, people were talking about it on the train, people talked about it in a pub. 300 people turned up at this pub, and halfway through this bloke puts his hand up and says, what happens to the economy if we leave? And I said, well, we don't know, obviously, but there are some forecasts, and if you sort of average out these forecasts, they're talking about, a 2 to 8% hit to the economy. So ultimately, most serious economists think British GDP will be smaller if we leave than it would have been if we stayed. Okay? And a woman at the back stood up and screamed at me. This is a pub, she'd had a few drinks. She said, that's your frigging GDP, not mine. All right? Now, you can look at that in several ways. You can look at that as being, that's silly, that makes no sense. Or you could say, actually, what that woman is saying, one of two things. Either you're lying, and I don't think she meant that, and in fact I talked to her afterwards. But I think what she meant was you come here from London with all your aggregate economic figures, and they mean nothing to people up here in Newcastle where wages are stagnant, the cost of living is going up. We don't believe you. And that, I think, haunted the Remain camp. I remember at one point where Stuart Rose did a press conference in which he said, but don't these people realise if we vote to leave the European Union, the city of London will be damaged and house prices will fall. All right? Now, I suspect that woman in Newcastle ticked those boxes and thought, really? Oh, fantastic. I mean, so that growing division in perceptions and in lived experience, I think, contributed. And my point here, I suppose, is this. In the referendum of 2016, 2.8 million people voted who hadn't bothered to vote in the general election of 2015, okay? Because they couldn't see anything worth voting for. And the fact is, the majority of those 2.8 million people voted to leave. And I think that, in a sense, plays into my argument, which is the referendum was about more than Brussels. It was about a profound sense of dissatisfaction from people who'd effectively opted out of politics, either recently or for many years. People who hadn't voted for ages, people who'd never voted before, were convinced, and actually in parentheses, let me say, one of the fantastic ironies, and there are many of them around the Brexit referendum, was that Matthew Elliott, the man who led the campaign to keep first past the post and had argued it was a fantastic voting system in 2011, pops up again in 2016 as chief exec of Vote Leave, and exploits dissatisfaction with first past the post absolutely brilliantly. In the sense that Vote Leave were going around saying, look, unlike in an election, your vote actually counts this time. Even if you're in a safe seat, it doesn't matter because it's an aggregate of all votes, so get out and vote. And they were spectacularly successful. That was the triumph of the Leave campaign, not in making people change their minds. If you look at the polling from 2012 to 2016, virtually no one changed their mind about membership of the European Union. People continue to believe exactly what they'd always believed. But turnout was crucial. And what happened was in Leave areas, they got the turnout up. And one of the reasons, incidentally, before I move on, why people didn't change their minds is that Brexit isn't a traditional political issue, it's an issue connected with values. That is to say, actually, one of the close correlations you find if you're trying to figure out what makes Brexit voters tick is the correlation between people who think we should bring back the death penalty and people who voted to leave the European Union. This isn't a traditional political issue. The Times, the Red Box, if you don't read the Red Box from the Times, you should read it because A, it's very, very funny, and B, it's very informative. But Matt Chorley commissioned a poll for the Times Red Box of a few thousand people that YouGov did, and they found an 88% correlation between your attitude towards Mrs. Brown's Boys, the TV programme, and your position on the Brexit referendum. If you like Mrs. Brown's Boys, you are probably a leaver. If you don't like it, you're probably a Remainer. So my point is, this is cultural in a very, very profound sense. It's not captured by your traditional left-right division. It is about values, it is about culture. And that's one of the reasons why minds don't change, because actually values change far slower than political opinions. And it's also, which I'll come back to, one of the reasons why our politics is in such a mess now, because our political system isn't equipped to deal with a profound split over values. Okay. So what's happened since? Let me just say a couple of things about where we've got to since the referendum. Firstly, it is simply not true that it is simply because of the unique incompetence of our government or the lack of a majority or whatever else it is that Brexit is proving so difficult. Brexit would have been difficult for Superman with a majority of 400. Okay? It is a very, very, very hard thing to do. We've got a very good friend in the Department for Rating the EU who's been to every round of negotiations. And when he was there last week, apparently, he said one of the EU team pulled him to one side and said, the reason we drafted Article 50 the way we did was to make sure that only the British civil service would have a cat-in-hell's chance of making it work. It is hard, okay? Under any circumstances, it would be hard. Second thing I would say is an awful lot has been accomplished. There are a huge number of very detailed technical issues involved in the Brexit talks that I, for one, at the start thought, my God, portability of social security rights, European health insurance, they'll never agree on that. There are too many layers of complexity. And they have agreed on it. So it's simply not the case that we haven't made any progress at all. But progress has been limited, and there are big issues remaining. I'll come back to Ireland very, very briefly in a minute. But what we've been doing since the referendum, essentially, is trying to deal with the fact that we included in a binary choice, essentially a multiple choice set of answers. That's to say, on the referendum paper itself, we were presented with leave or remain. And we've spent the last 2 years figuring out what the hell leave means, because no one knows. And if you think back to that summer of 2016, we had that quite amusing and slightly boring at the same time debate about how you describe Brexit. So we had chaotic Brexit, managed Brexit, black Brexit, white Brexit. We had red, white and blue Brexit from the Prime Minister. And a journalist coined the best one that has subsequently sadly died, which was Dog's Brexit. But what you have in this sort of war between the adjectives is an attempt to try and figure out what the hell does Brexit mean? Does it mean we're going to be Norway in terms of our relations with the European Union? Does it mean we're going to be North Korea? And at which point in between those two extremes are we actually going to end up? And of course, what happens is that Theresa May, on that Sunday before the Conservative Party conference in 2016, stands up in front of the assembled faithful and says, you know what, I'll tell you what Brexit means. And she said it. No freedom of movement, no European Court of Justice, no customs union, no single market. And I remember I was sitting out in the hall watching her thinking, blimey, she's gone for the extreme. And then thinking, which should warn you as to why everything I'm about to say about the future will be wrong, this line will never hold. But of course this line has held. The Prime Minister's stated formal position on Brexit has not changed at all since October of 2016. Let me just very, very quickly say something about Ireland, because if I don't say something about Ireland, someone always asks, and just say that it is the big issue that remains to be resolved in the negotiations so far, and the reason it's the big issue that remains to be resolved is there is no easy, obvious way of resolving it. There are three options with Ireland. One is you stick a hard border down the middle of the island. You have regulatory unalignment between the UK and the rest of the EU, but both parties have signed up to not having a hard border. Okay? The second option is Britain remains inside the single market and the customs union, in which case we don't need a border, but Theresa May has signed up to leaving the single market and the customs union, so that crosses her red line. The third option is you let Northern Ireland remain aligned and within the customs union, and you put the regulatory border in the Irish Sea. Now, a lot of people talk bunk about this and say, if only it wasn't for the Democratic Unionist Party, we'd be able to do this. The DUP are the logjam in the road. Not at all. Do you seriously think the Conservative and Unionist Party, to give it its full name, would happily sign up to a deal that involved not only an internal regulatory border inside the United Kingdom, but the European Union essentially enjoying a sort of protectorate over part of this country? Where else in the world would that be acceptable? And secondly, the Labour Party can't sign up to this. Why? Because Labour's electoral strategy, insofar as this current shower has an electoral strategy, is we are going to win power by making sure we win back all the votes from the SNP. That's Labour's route to power, winning seats in Scotland. If you allow Northern Ireland a unique constitutional situation, who will benefit in Scotland from this? It won't be the Labour Party, it'll be the SNP. So Labour are very, very wary of this. Labour in opposition, so they don't have to say it out loud. But if push came to shove, Labour would find it very, very hard indeed politically to vote in favour of a special status for Northern Ireland. Right, this is the bit where you can start checking your phones and ignoring me because it all gets a bit tendentious. What we have at the moment, I think, in the Brexit debate in this country, and I'm going to focus on this country, but I'm happy to take questions about the EU side if you want, is, if you like, a battle between politics and economics in the context of law. That's probably how social scientists should think about this. I say in the context of law because many Brexiters, of course, when we voted to leave the European Union, assumed that the EU would break all its legal principles apart in order to accommodate us. So yeah, they'll give us the free market. They'll give us a single market without free movement. They'll change the legal situation. They'll amend the treaties. I mean, it's us after all, so they'll do it. But actually, one of the first things that's transpired in the Brexit talks is that EU law is a constant. No one on the EU side is in the business of trying to alter it for the benefit of the United Kingdom. So that's what takes us to this trade-off between economics and politics. If we do a hard Brexit, which for the sake of this conversation, let's say we leave the single market and the customs union, okay, we get a Canada deal, all right? If we do a Canada deal, it will have a significant impact on our economy. One of the UK and the Changing Europe teams does the economic forecasting, and their forecast is over 10 years, the first 10 years after we leave the single market and the customs union, British trade with the European Union will fall by between 25 and 40%. Okay, now by any measure that's big. That translates into a hit to GDP of 3 to 4% annually. Not, and I'll come back to this, not a fall in GDP, but the GDP being 3 to 4% annually lower than it would have been had we remained within the European Union. Again, these are massive figures. To put it in terms of money, the IFS estimate that this means that by 2030, the Treasury will be spending £40 billion a year less because it won't have the money because of falling tax revenues, because of the hit to economic activity in this country. So by any measure, these are very, very big numbers. I'll come back to what they mean politically, because actually that to me is far from clear. But our economy will be hit by leaving the single market and the customs union compared to what would have been the case if we stayed within. But enter the politics. The government know this. The government have those economic forecasts that were leaked to BuzzFeed that have those detailed projections about what leaving the European Union will mean. But Mrs May also has the European Research Group. She has Jacob Rees-Mogg. She has that group of 60 MPs who have enough signatures between them to spark a leadership contest. It is also the fact that the local elections reveal that some 70% of those who vote Conservative now are Leavers. The Tories have become the party of leave. So rubbing out, or pinking, as is the new jargon in Westminster, her red lines, if it's to be done at all, has to be done very, very gently and subtly, because the political price to pay for reneging on what she said about Brexit could be a very, very high one for the party. And that is the bind, that is the dilemma, and that is the decision that is being wrestled with this week and will be fought over in Chequers on Friday. It's a real shame they're not having a sleepover, because I think some of the headlines could have been fantastic, but they're going for the day on Friday. And essentially the Cabinet have been told you can choose between three options. No deal, and no one but Boris takes that one seriously anymore, because everyone knows it'll be a catastrophe. Okay? No deal does mean the prospect of the flights not taking off. It does mean the prospect of, Kent being the middle of the mother of all traffic jams from the coast to London. It means all that stuff just because legal certainty will evaporate. We'll no longer know under what legal system traders are trading with European countries, because the EU treaties take care of all that now. So no one wants no deal, whatever the government says, and actually the government itself doesn't say very much anymore. So the choice is between two options. One, soft Brexit. And soft Brexit doesn't mean Norway, it means Norway plus. Because to incorporate the desires of Northern Ireland and the Republic, you have to include agriculture. And to take account of the desires of the British manufacturing industry, you have to include the customs union as well. So it'll be Norway plus agriculture plus the customs union, and I suspect whatever Michael Gove says, plus fisheries as well, because it kind of makes no sense for fisheries to be left outside that deal. So this is the softest of soft Brexits. Okay, that's one option. We remain aligned, we stay in the customs union. The other option is Canada minus. Now what I mean by Canada minus is a free trade deal of the kind that Canada has with the European Union. The minus simply because we're not going to be able to negotiate the sorts of deal they have in services within the 2 or so years we've got left. Because even the Canada deal, which is pretty crap on services actually, even the Canada deal takes a lot of time to negotiate. Okay? And what's the problem with the Canada deal for the UK? One, it means customs checks. It doesn't solve the Northern Irish issue, and it doesn't solve the Dover issue. And two, there is virtually nothing on services, and the British economy is 80% a service economy. So whilst this might work quite well for Canada, it doesn't work particularly well for the UK. So that, essentially, is the choice that the Cabinet is being presented with. There is no reason why Theresa May has to make them choose this week. I mean, the press like to say showdown. There was a showdown summit last week. I don't know if you noticed it, no one else did. I mean, it was just a bit of a damp squib showdown. The showdown comes in autumn. By December, we have to agree a deal with the European Union, or the European Parliament won't have time to approve it. Okay? So actually, she can fudge again if she wants. The white paper can be like the white paper they released in 2017, which was basically the Lancaster House speech reproduced with pictures, which is a total waste of everyone's time because all the contradictions were there, written down for everyone to see and no one. If she could do that again. I'm sure they have a draft of a white paper that says what we want is cake and eat. So we'll have this, and actually they'll produce a white paper that is great except for the fact that the European Union will not even consider it because it's so silly. They could do that, it's a stalling maneuver. Or they could choose. It seems to me what happens now depends on the politics. Whether you go Canada or Norway, significant numbers of senior people in the cabinet are going to hate it. And there will be resignations from the cabinet. Now, this is a political calculation. If, say, and I've no evidence which way she's going to go, the rumour is that Theresa May is now leaning towards soft rather than hard Brexit. Let's say she goes towards soft Brexit, just hypothetically. At least 2 of the 3 Brexiters will resign. The question then is, if we do it now, it gives us August. Maybe in August people forget who Boris Johnson is, we come back, crisis over, we get on with the process of governing. The alternative is we wait till October, we fudge now, and we make the choice in October, perhaps after the Conservative Party conference, where the last ability of these people to grandstand in front of the party is gone, make the choice, rush to the summit, sign it off before anyone can react. And there's a majority in Parliament to vote for this. I don't know what she'll do. I absolutely do not know what's going to happen on Friday, but it seems to me you have this choice of 3 options. It has to be made. It has to be made before autumn. They're building this up to be something quite big. But it wouldn't be the first time that they've marched us up the hill to march us back down again. So I wouldn't discount the possibility that Theresa May does what she's done so well for so long, which is nothing. That is to say, she just fudges the issue for the moment, knowing that the fight is going to have to be had at a later point. Now, just a word, because I mentioned Parliament, on Parliament. No, Parliament's there, look. There's a lot of uncertainty over what happens in Parliament. I don't know what's going to happen, but in my defence, a lot of the MPs who are the swing voters don't know how they're going to vote, so I can't be expected to know. There is going to be a vote on an amendment to the trade bill before recess, which is at the end of July. It seems to me there is a majority in favour of the amendment that calls for the government to negotiate a customs union with the European Union. One strategy for Theresa May would be to say, please don't vote for the amendment, while secretly going, please vote for the amendment, please vote for the amendment, so that she gets her hands tied by Parliament. That might be effective for her. It might say, well, look, Boris, I'm really sorry, I wanted to leave the customs union, Parliament's told me I can't, what am I going to do? It might be that forms part of the governmental strategy, but I don't know how that vote is going to go. What I'm more certain about is what happens when we get to this meaningful vote in the autumn. It won't be meaningful. And let me try and explain to you why. Theresa May is going to come back from Brussels with a deal of some kind. Okay, it might be a soft Brexit, it might be a hard Brexit, it might be something else. Some sort of mushy middle Brexit. She comes back to Parliament, we're talking October, November, okay? There are probably 22 potential rebels against a hard Brexit on the Conservative benches. They're faced with this dilemma then, which is, if you vote against the Prime Minister's deal, the Prime Minister has to go. Theresa May's entire reputation politically is staked on these Brexit negotiations. You can't negotiate a deal, bring it back to Parliament, lose and stay in office. That would just not be credible. At that point, imagine that you're, depending on your gender, Nicky Morgan or Dominic Grieve. So you're sitting there thinking, what do I do? If I vote against this deal, she might go, in which case there is a very real prospect that the Brexit negotiations will be finished off by Jacob, or by Michael Gove, or by a whole host of people who actually would be even worse, in my book, in terms of what they want from Brexit, than Theresa May. Okay? And there is also a slight danger if the Prime Minister resigns, by some means, because Parliament is so unpredictable at the moment, we might end up having a general election, which opens up the even worse nightmare scenario. If you ask any Tory soft Brexiter, what do you think will be worse for the United Kingdom than a hard Brexit? They would say, John McDonnell. All right, that's your answer. This Labour Party in power would make Brexit seem like a triumph, okay, for Tory Remainers. You increase the likelihood of getting in a Labour government. So I suspect when push comes to shove, Tory potential rebels will find it quite hard to rebel in the autumn. We need to get something sorted out before then for those people to have their voices heard. On the other side of the aisle, you have the Labour Party, and the Labour Party, basically, its leadership is convinced that its Brexit position, for which read no position at all, because they've been fantastically ambiguous, is a vote winner. When I say no position at all, I give you a challenge. Go to the Labour Party Manifesto for 2017, read the chapter, it's not a paragraph, it's a chapter on international trade, and then email me and tell me what their policy is on the customs union. It is impossible. It is a masterpiece of obfuscation. It absolutely is. And they think it works, and they're right. So that is a diagram that shows changes in vote share between the 2015 and the 2017 election. To my right, your left, are the most Remain voting seats. On the other side are the most Leave voting seats. What you see is the Conservatives picked up vote share in Leave seats. Labour picks up vote share across the board. And what the Labour leadership reckon they've managed to do, and there is evidence to support this, is that they have persuaded Brexiters that they're Brexity enough to do it, and they have persuaded Leavers that they're not quite as mad as the Tories. And that worked quite nicely in 2017. If you project ahead, this is harder to explain, I always forget this. The right of the middle line are seats that swung heavily from the Conservatives to Labour. Seats on the left are seats, in 2017, that swung heavily from Labour to the Conservatives. Above the line are Remain seats, below the line are Leave seats. To cut a long story short, target marginals, red for Labour, blue for Tories. Labour's target marginals and Tory target marginals are disproportionately concentrated below the line, which means the battle is being fought in Leave territory. So whilst it is obviously the case, and it's absolutely true, that 60-70% of Labour voters, 60-70% of Labour members don't like Brexit. A lot of those people are based in southern London constituency where the Labour vote is weighed rather than counted. If you're in Lambeth, you can say what you want about Brexit if you're chucker because you've got a huge majority. It's never going to be threatened. But the places that matter electorally, the places where target seats are where the margin of victory is less than 5%, where actually the dwindling number of marginals are up for grabs, tend to be in places where people voted Leave, which means that the Labour leadership is very, very sensitive indeed to not being seen to abandon Leave voters, which I think is why Labour will struggle, whatever momentum managed to achieve at the Labour Party conference in September, Labour will struggle to move on to a position of supporting a second referendum. So, we face a choice. If we do hard Brexit, it will impact on our economy. It's worth saying that over and over again because there are still people out there who say it won't. They're wrong. Okay, they are wrong. If you make trade with your largest and nearest trading partner more difficult and more expensive, which is essentially what Brexit is, it will have a negative impact on your economy, at least in the short to medium term. Okay? But it's worth saying, because there are a lot of people out there who support a second referendum who are saying this is Armageddon, this is the end of the world. No, it's not. It's not Armageddon. It's not the end of the world for several reasons. One, the impact won't be immediate and overnight. We won't suddenly wake up on the 30th of March next year in some barren wasteland where the shelves are empty and the economy is tanked. We will still be one of the biggest economies in the world. But our economy will not grow as fast or be as large as would have been the case had we remained inside the European Union. That is quite a subtle effect. And if you want to turn around to voters and say, see, I told you you were wrong, you kind of have to count on them looking at graphs that show relative GDP growth across the European Union and comparing the UK to it. I don't think, whilst I think there will be a significant impact, I think it'll be more subtle than many people claim. And I think those Remainers who are exaggerating now are well on the way to losing the political battle that will start on the 29th of March next year. That is to say, the battle about the implications of Brexit. If you start by exaggerating, as the Treasury exaggerated in its short-term forecast of April 2016, you basically hamstring yourself in the debate to come because people will say, well, look, you projected that we'd fall off a cliff, we haven't. You know, you're wrong, again. So I think there is a danger to that. The second thing to say about the economic impact of Brexit is it will almost certainly be disproportionately large in areas that voted Leave. If you do a map of the United Kingdom by region, looking at the degree to which different regions of the United Kingdom are dependent on trade with the European Union, the rather ironic picture you get is there is an almost perfect correlation between your dependence on trade with the European Union and how strongly you voted to leave. Okay, that is to say, the two parts of the United Kingdom relatively least dependent on trade with the EU are London and Scotland. Two parts of the United Kingdom that, of course, voted most strongly to remain. Now, the picture is fuzzy. it's fuzzy in a lot of ways. It's fuzzy, one, because this is largely a manufacturing industry impact, and some economists think actually services are far more price sensitive than manufactured goods, which means that London will bear a disproportionate share. Even though it's not so dependent on trade with the EU, it will bear a disproportionate share of the pain. But what equally I think is undeniable is that big cities, because they have young, mobile, educated populations, will bounce back from any Brexit shock quicker than smaller cities and towns. And smaller cities and towns are already not doing so well economically. One of the big new divides in Britain, and if any of you study politics, it's a really fascinating subject, I think, is the divide between cities and towns. In general, obviously with some wrinkles, because there always are, cities voted Remain, towns voted Leave. In general, cities vote Labour, towns vote Conservative. In general, cities are doing relatively well economically, towns are not. And actually it is a political and economic divide that no one really seems to be getting to grips with at the moment, and which will be absolutely fundamental for the future of our economy and indeed our country. But the impact on regions is mediated via government. You can't just say, oh, we're very dependent on trade with the European Union, we're going to attack. If the government, for instance, said, okay, look, before Brexit, we're going to undertake a massive process of investment in the West Midlands to mitigate any Brexit shock, that will have an impact on how that is felt. And one of the curious and interesting, and I think positive things about the Brexit referendum, is its way it has shattered the centrist liberal consensus that existed up to the 23rd of June 2016. That is to say, think tankers talk about the Overton window. But what they mean by Overton window is the range of policy choices that it is feasible to discuss in any given political context. The Overton window in Britain now has become an Overton set of humongous French doors, if I can use that analogy. Because our political debate is just unrecognisable from the one that was going on in this country when you had those two rather centrist liberal economic parties in charge and alternating in power. We are talking now about intergenerational fairness. We are talking about the gap between North and South. One of the funniest things about the referendum for me is the way that people in the South woke up on the 24th of June and noticed the North. You know, they noticed the North in that kind of, who are those horrible people up there who have voted so that, you know, Penelope can't do Erasmus next year? But nevertheless, they've noticed the North. And we're having a real debate about unequal investment, about why it is that the government seems intent on having Crossrail 50 before we can have a Transpennine Railway. All those issues are now on the political agenda. Now, don't get me wrong. They could and should have been on the political agenda a long, long time ago. These are inequality, intergenerational fairness, North versus South, have all been problems in our society for quite a while. They've been hidden by the fact that actually they didn't really cost anyone votes because of the electoral system I talked about earlier. All of a sudden, the referendum has brought them into sharp relief. Also, given what I've said about the economy, it probably would have been easier to address these issues with the economy we had while we were in the European Union than it is going to be to address them with what in all likelihood will be an economy under severe strain once we've left the European Union. Nevertheless, I draw a degree of heart from the fact that actually now we're having a political debate about stuff we should have been talking about ages ago. And there is a chance that these things might be addressed. And you can think of all sorts of ways. You have a proper skills policy, you have proper devolution of political power within England as well as the UK. You have a fairer funding model for the region. There are all sorts of ways you can start to address the kinds of issues that partly led to the Brexit vote. And in fact, one way of looking at Brexit for me is, yes, it might be that Brexit is economically painful, but if 10 to 15 years down the line, Britain ends up being a smaller economy than it otherwise would have been, but a significantly fairer economy than it otherwise would have been, then it seems to me we're building a decent platform for the future. Problem, of course, is you need to have a degree of faith in both our politicians and our government in general to think that this is going to happen. Now, on the former, I have very little faith whatsoever, because it does seem to me we lack, remembers the video camera, thinks about his wording carefully. I don't think there are many politicians of very high calibre in positions of power in this country at the moment, I have to say. It doesn't inspire me with confidence, the sight of our politicians at the moment. But the second and most depressing thing, I think, is that Brexit is crowding everything. think any of us can sit down and write down an agenda for government that tackles some of the problems this country faces, from ridiculously low levels of productivity to productivity gaps. The productivity gap in the UK between the most productive and the least productive parts of the UK is on the same scale as the productivity gap within the Eurozone as a whole. Okay, that gives you some idea of how big it is in this country. But no one in government can do anything but Brexit. I mean, one of the staggering things about post-Brexit is the degree to which we no longer have anyone governing us. Everyone is scurrying around worrying about Brexit. We have no health policy worth speaking of, no education policy worth speaking of. And for all the fact that Theresa May made a fantastic speech on the day she became Prime Minister, and I think that speech she gave on the steps of Downing Street was one of the best I've heard by a Western politician that got where populism came from. For all the fact that she made that speech, government has done little or nothing to address the problems that she talked about on that day. So that's a hard Brexit. It's economically painful. A soft Brexit leads to political problems in several ways. One, can you sell it to the party? Will you survive as Prime Minister if you try and sell it to the party? Will the Conservatives lose the next election because they seem to betray what they've said about Brexit? The other set of problems are if Britain joins the European Economic Area, which is the obvious way of staying in the single market, could we make that work? The European Economic Area is a very subtle, sophisticated political system. And what it requires is a degree of subtlety and self-restraint on the part of participants. That's to say, yes, the EEA does give you slightly more wiggle room when it comes to applying EU law than membership of the EU itself. But everyone's got to do it sotto voce. You negotiate it in committees, you don't talk about it out loud, and everything works. Can you think of two words that apply less to Britain than subtle and self-restraint? The danger with Britain is we'll blow the system apart. We'll go in, we'll not apply law properly. But we won't, rather than negotiating it in a committee room in Brussels, Ian Duncan Smith will make a speech celebrating it. And actually that will test the system to breaking point. Cameron's former EU advisor Ivan Rogers likens Britain joining the EEA to trying to stuff an elephant in a sock. And I think there's a degree of truth in that, which is to say, even that outcome, which is the economically less painful outcome, I wonder whether it's politically sustainable, whether it creates a stable political equilibrium, and to be honest, I doubt it. And just out of politeness, let me talk briefly about what happens if we remain in the European Union. I mean, one of the beauties of Britain at the moment is that no outcome can be ruled out completely. And whilst I think it's very unlikely we have another referendum, in fact, let me show you why I think it's unlikely. It's because that's public opinion on whether voting to leave the European Union is a good idea or a bad idea. There's been a shift towards bad idea, but it's hardly an outright reversal of public opinion. And more to the point, if you dig into those numbers, the degree to which bad idea has taken the lead over good idea is almost entirely down to the fact that people who couldn't vote in 2016 because they were too young or didn't vote in 2016 now say they'd vote Remain. There are precious few people changing their minds on Brexit out there. So I think it's very, very unlikely that we have another referendum, but if we do think about it, does that create that stable equilibrium I was talking about? I think it creates a sort of hideous political Groundhog Day. We wake up, let's imagine we have that second referendum because Parliament insists on it, we vote to Remain by, pluck a figure at random, 52-48, there we go. Because it's not going to be clear, because the country is still divided down the middle. The best you can hope for, if you want that sort of thing, is a narrow margin of victory for Remain. Then what happens? What happens then is you wake up in 2011. Nigel Farage is going to be polling at 30 to 35%. Why? Because there's a degree of credibility to him saying, I told you they'd betray you. The Tories are divided down the middle on British membership of the European Union. While we're squabbling at home, we'll be wrecking the EU because no British minister will be able to vote in favour of anything ever again because of the degree to which this is now a salient issue at home. And I think ultimately the end game there is we'll have to do a best out of three just to keep everyone quiet. We have to do it again down the line because the political uncertainty would be overwhelming. So we face a world of difficult choices, and I don't think there's much we can do about that. So in conclusion, let me just say firstly, well, one, obviously, I've no earthly clue what's going to happen. Britain is a very uncertain place. Secondly, Brexit is changing and will change everything about us. It's changed our constitution already in terms of relationships with the evolved in terms of the relationship between executive and legislature, the number of ways it is changing our constitution, and no one notices because we're too busy focusing on the negotiations of the process. There are massive changes taking place to our constitutional infrastructure that we haven't had time to talk about properly yet. Our economy will change, our economy is changing. You'll see the implications in terms of foreign direct investment, in terms of which parts of the country do well, which parts of the country do badly, in terms of the future of manufacturing industry in this country, all sorts of ways. And of course, it's changing our politics. The last election showed us the class basis of our politics has been eroded by Brexit. Tories are making gains amongst working class voters. Labour have Kensingtons, the Tories have Stoke South. One of the reasons why both our political parties seem paralysed, and this goes back to the point I was saying about values, the values divide cuts down the middle of them, is that neither political party now really knows who they are for. Is Jeremy Corbyn's priority to hang on to Kensington or to try and win back Mansfield? That has implications for his policies when it comes to higher rate taxpayers, I'd have thought. Okay. Do the Conservatives want to win back those liberal business people they've been busy alienating for 2 years? Or do they see their future as being the party of the Brexity North, the traditional Labour heartlands? And actually there are debates going on inside both parties at the moment, but there are no answers. No one knows who they stand for anymore. And finally, let me just say, I think this really is a unique moment for social science. It's a unique moment for social science because, like never before, there's a massive social science-shaped hole at the heart of government. Levels of uncertainty have never been higher. We have to rewrite the political economy of this country over the next decade. And actually, what you will find in Westminster and Whitehall is a demand like there's never been before for people to come in and say, well, actually, I've worked on this. I know how it works. And actually, let me give you some clues as to how you might go about doing this. I think this requires academics to do things well as government to ask. We need to be not campaigners, we need to be social scientists. We need to work on the basis of information and not prejudice. And we need to find a way to talk about our work that doesn't exaggerate it like so many economists do their forecasts, but actually says, actually with due modesty, this is about as far as my research will take us, but it might be a good starting point. But I do think we have an opportunity as social scientists, and in fact a duty as social scientists at a time like this to get involved in policy. And if I can end exactly where I started, if we can help you do that in any way, do get in touch. Thank you.